Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and today we're going to be going down another rabbit trail, asking the question, how do we stir up one another to love and good works when other Christians are freaking annoying? Well, let's get into it. So, right now in my residency, I am in a two-part series. This is part 2 on transition and leadership. Last week, I preached on Joshua 1 through 9, and if you would like the recap for that, I invite you to go check out last week's episode where I go down the rabbit trail. I do recap the sermon, but I also go down the rabbit trail of why do we gender verses? Today, or this past Sunday, the series here on transitions and leadership went to Hebrews 10, 19 through 25. Verse 25, of course, being the famous, "Go to church, you heathens" verse. That is the verse that had often been used as the reason why believers should definitely go to church. Here's the thing. There's kind of this multiple layer approach here to this sermon, so just hang in there with me. Verses 19 through 21 is a big recap. Basically what's going on in the book of Hebrews up until this point is that the author is showing the Jewish audience that Jesus is better, to use one of the modern cliches. Jesus is better. Jesus is greater. He's greater than the angels. He brought in a better covenant than the law. He is a more sufficient sacrifice than the sacrificial system, and he is the great high priest over all the priests. We then get to this section, and in light of who Jesus is, what he has done, and what he is doing, believers can do 4 things. That's verses 22 through 25. So believers can approach God with confidence. Believers can hold on to their confession of faith. Believers can stir up one another to love and good works. Hold that thought. And believers can go to church. And I talk about, well, let's be literal to what the text says. We're going to be literal here. Believers are to continue to gather together. So, this idea of we go to church because that is the thing that we do, because the Bible says so, answers like that is actually not a good enough reason. The reason that we go to church is because of Jesus. The reason that we can do any of those things is because of Jesus. But we don't go to church just because. We go to church because of Jesus. How does this relate to transition and leadership? Well, it is because leaders, pastors, come and go. We're pretty far removed anymore from long tenures in the pulpit. Anytime you hear about a pastor who's been at a church for 20 plus years is almost an anomaly at this point. A pastor being at one church for 10 years even seems to be a little out of the ordinary anymore. Here in America, that is. I don't know what it's like in other countries. I'd be curious to find out. So leaders come and go, and whether it's on, a joyous occasion of a retirement after a long tenure at a church or scandal or whatever, leaders come and go, right? Jesus remains. And because of that, Jesus is greater than our pastors. And a church needs to have their identity in Jesus, who is greater, versus their pastor, who will come and go, who is a human, who will let them down, who might be in it for the wrong reasons, for celebrity status. Jesus remains, and Jesus is greater. So that's, in a nutshell, what we sent this series on transitions and leadership home with. In today's episode, like I said, we're going to talk about that third point, that point of stirring up one another to love and good works, specifically when Christians are freaking annoying. Hey, look at this. This episode is coming out right before the election. So just, think about that person. I don't need to even really explain further than that. That person you have in your mind who's a believer in Jesus, just like you, loves Jesus just like you, and they're freaking annoying on social media or when you get together with them. politically, theologically, they're just freaking annoying. You know what I mean? Yeah, I don't really even have to spend too much time on this, on explaining who I'm talking about, right? So here's how this is a rabbit trail. We're going to take a little detour on our rabbit trail. It's rabbit trail inception now. As I talk a little bit about homiletics and a little bit of some changes I've been making to my preaching style. When it comes to application, there's kind of like broadly two schools of thought here. There's the very specific approach and the broader approach. Both have their pros and cons. And I would say in my preaching and teaching for the past 10 years, I've been a little bit more in the very applicable, very specific approach, that first approach, because that is often what gets taught. Because when you give a congregation very specific next steps of, okay, this is what you do in light of this passage, A, B, C, D, you're giving the congregation very specific things to do, very specific behaviors and mindsets to hone in on, those kind of things. You're making sure that the congregation is being held accountable to do something in light of the passage. The problem there, though, and you may have caught a very specific word there, this approach can very easily turn into behavior modification. This is where TED Talk with a Bible verse kind of gets thrown in, of like, we're kind of moving away from sitting under the authority of God's word to here's 10 ways to make sure you're following Jesus, versus the broader approach where you're going to sit under the word of God and take it, I don't want to say at face value, that's not what we're doing here, but take it a little bit more in stride within its context and giving the congregation the individual responsibility to follow through on this text. Obviously, people, the con, in this broader approach to application can just nod their heads and walk away and just, not think about the reality of the truth that you've just presented to them. But I think there can be just as much a weight of responsibility to the text when you are giving it to them and saying, go and do likewise, and kind of letting the individual members of the congregation decide how they are going to follow through on the text. Now, I have been pushing myself to preach a little bit more this way, as a challenge, really, and also to see if it really makes that big of a difference. Doing a little bit of a social experiment for myself here, a little bit of a preaching experiment, because probably being able to do a DMin study on expository preaching is not going to be a thing in my future. I guess I don't know that for a fact, but that's, kind of where my head's at right now. Anyway, so when it comes to this application part, I spent, specifically on this part about stirring up one another to love and good works, I presented it like this. I said, when you get together with other Christians at church, at the diner, down the road, at, just kind of that broad, like when you get together at some point during the week with other Christians, what is the outcome of that time together? Is it gossip? Is it anger? Is it despair? Is it all these other things that don't look like Jesus? Or is it an overflow of love for one another and for your community, and the encouragement or desire to go do good things in the name of God to his glory? Like, that seems to be like at a baseline what's going on here. When you're together with other believers, you should feel the desire to love on one another, love on your community, love your neighbor, right? Love God, and to go do good things to his glory, right? The thing is, though, and this is where the rabbit trail officially starts, how do you do that when other Christians can just be so bothersome? This has been the thing that I've been wrestling with for most of this year. I'm doing better. Thanks for asking. I'm doing a lot better than where I was earlier this year, I still like to think of my new house and my previous house as my monastery, that this is my space to kind of be. This is the safest place I feel like I can be right now theologically. It's just kind of like with myself, with my books, with my podcasts, and just kind of processing on my own. But definitely moving further down the field towards being comfortable and having a desire to be around other Christians and to go to church again. That's all good things. But this processing of how do I stir up other people to love and good works that, I don't want to be with them. I don't want to do ministry with them. Think of it like this. Last year, I flew down to North Carolina for the Every Tribes, Denominations, and Tongues Convention to do ministry with a bunch of guys who we all disagree theologically. I don't think there's a single person in the Anazao Ministries podcast network then or now that we all see eye to eye completely. We all have different takes, theologies, philosophies, political stances, and somehow this great experiment is working. We all have good fellowship together. We want to do ministry together. There's always this kind of like joking talk of like, hey, someday we'll go visit Brandon in the Midwest because I am the sole representation of the Midwest. Every other podcasting friend of mine is on the East Coast. I don't know how I did that. I guess there's no podcasters on the West Coast either. I don't know anybody out there. So, or another example would be, the Theology Beer Camp, okay? Because I know a lot of the Anazao guys have been invited so far. I'm a little baby band. I'm a little tiny podcast. They don't know I exist. It's fine. It's okay. It's okay. I'm not jealous. I'm not mad. Seriously. Although Kevin Max was there, so that part I was jealous about. But, like, the Theology Beer Camp is very much more further liberal theology that I don't necessarily hold to. And yet, if they invited me over someday when I pop up on their radar unexpectedly, if they invited me to do a panel, do a podcast episode, whatever the thing is, I would say yes, not just because I'm really hoping Kevin Max goes back again, but because I have a desire to do ministry with the people who are associated with this conference. At the same time, there are people much closer to home to me here in the Midwest, the Chicagoland area, who I want nothing to do with the ministry that they are doing. I want nothing to do with it. I don't think it is effective. I do not necessarily fully agree with their stances, even though they are far more conservative in their theology. I have nothing. I have no desire to do ministry with them. I have no desire sometimes to even be around some of these people. I don't know why I still have them on Facebook as friends, honestly. But we have this thing here in Scripture calling us to stir up one another to love and good works. Keeping in mind that when the author of Hebrews, whoever he or she was, because I'm actually kind of on board with the whole she answer, by the way. Paul or Priscilla, I'm kind of into those two ideas. We have this call to love one another, keeping in mind stir up one another to love and good works. When this was written, there was no social media at the time, right? And there was no social media, right? There was none of that. And nowadays, even though there is this shift among many Christians to a more true sense of discipleship and community, although that still kind of looks a little wonky depending on who's running it or who's doing it. But, we have more of a focus on community within Christianity, but we also have a big thing about boundaries, setting healthy boundaries. And trust me, this is not me dunking on on healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries are a good thing, but how do we reconcile social media, healthy boundaries, and the fact that there are just some people who are difficult to love with stirring up one another to love and good works? And sorry, I don't really have all of the answers here. That's part of and this kind of like continuing from last week's episode on gendering verses. Like, I don't necessarily have all of the answers here, but I've been sitting on this for a few days. So here's just some of my thoughts and reflections on this. Let's break that down into two things: love and good works. How do I love someone who I disagree with politically, theologically? Because keep in mind, there are other people who I disagree with theologically, philosophically, politically, who I get along just fine with, who I want to be around, versus other people who I wouldn't go as far as to say I hate them or anything like that, but I don't necessarily want to have fellowship with them. I don't want to be in community with them, right? And I think when it comes to this, how do we love someone who you might disagree with? To me, this is me personally, I kind of have to look at how the disagreement is handled. Because, when I'm trying to think of an example. So Josh from Rethinking Faith, great guy, love his pro wrestling takes. We have very different theologies, but we've had very little interaction. But whenever the theology differences start coming up, it's very mutual and very respectful. It's very mutual respect and just hearing one another out. He might, if we really got into it, he might really call me out on certain things because I'm a forever student. I'm just always learning, right? Keep on studying. So he might call me out on certain things that I'm blind, kind of got a blind spot to, but overwhelmingly it's a heart of mutual respect for each other. Whereas the other people who I'm like, I don't want anything to do with you, it's like I said there at the beginning, they're kind of like jerks. How do you love a jerk? They're just, there's that whole school of Christian thought and whole school of approach to ministry of you have to have all the right answers. You have to have, I should put right answers in quotes. You have to have all the answers just ready to go. And it just makes me so frustrated when you give a rebuttal and they try to break it down scientifically of well, that's philosophical conundrum or something like that. They try to dissect your response or your question to make you feel dumb. And it's easy to make me feel dumb because I'm a forever student. Just call me out on anything and I'll feel dumb. It's part of my mental health package. But how do you love somebody who in the comments section is a jerk, or maybe even in real life is a jerk in how you talk to them? And this might not be the best of answers, but maybe sometimes the best way to love someone, especially through social media, is just not to engage. Just love on them by non-engagement, because those kind of people, even though they may say change my mind, that meme of the guy sitting at the table and it says something change my mind, I don't think that they don't actually want their mind changed. They want the fight, they want the argument, right? So maybe the best way to love somebody is to not engage, is to just keep it to yourself, because in the end, it's foolishness. It's meaningless to really get into the argument with them because they're just looking for a fight. Love on, pursue peace with one another as far as you're able to. How do you love someone who's difficult? I guess you just kind of ignore them when they're being difficult. I don't know if I really have too good of an answer beyond that. And obviously, hit up the comment section on this episode or slide into the show's DMs, email me, email seminarylife@gmail.com, any of those things to kind of weigh in on this, please, because, I'm still trying to figure this out too. But when it comes to that, like stirring up one another to love and good works, right? That is actually like the stickier part for me, because you're always going to find people who like maybe your personalities clash, and that could just be it. Maybe just all this in the end is just personality clashing, and some people are just rougher around the edges and I'm a squishy marshmallow. You never know. But that stirring to love and good works part, here's the thing. Sometimes that's the bigger hang up for me, is their approach to ministry. And I hate that I'm like talking in terms of the other here, but I don't know how else to talk about this. There's this, the picketing, the protesting, and I'm not talking about social justice, like racial matters here, but just over like small, I shouldn't say small things, because to them it's huge and everything's tied back to the gospel and the Great Commission. But just like the approach to witnessing and the approach to ministry, just like, I want nothing to do with how you're doing your ministry stuff, like the actual physical ministry part. I can't bless that. I can't pray for that. I can't, but at the same time, again, another square that's difficult to circle, or however that saying goes. How do you reconcile that with Jesus saying to his disciples, no, don't stop them, this group that's baptizing in my name who's not traveling with us, like let them be, let them do, is that it? Is that how we stir up one another to good works? Is just kind of that let it be approach? A little John MacArthur, not John MacArthur, theology podcast, a little Paul McCartney for everybody, like let it be, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Like, just if there is somebody who's doing ministry that you don't agree with, but they think they're following the Lord and passionate about it, and it's not technically hurting anyone or taking advantage of other people, do you just to stir up them to good works? Do you just let it be? I don't know. Because I feel like all my solutions right now are very passive. I'm aware of that, if that's what it sounds like. How do you love somebody who you disagree with? Just don't engage. How do you stir up somebody to good works when you don't agree with their good works? Just let it be and just don't worry about them. Like, I feel like it's very passive is the answers I'm giving here. It's also important to point out that sometimes a rabbit trail isn't necessarily a complete detour that doesn't fit in with the rest of the sermon. Technically, this all would have fit if I actually had more concrete answers, or would have presented this all more in concrete answers. I will say this came to mind. I forgot to mention this earlier during the part on how do we love someone who's difficult to love. Keep in mind, sometimes you or I am the difficult to love to. Well, I botched that line. Sometimes you're the difficult one to love. Sometimes I am the difficult one to love. And we don't want to think about ourselves like that. Like, obviously, we're the easiest person to love in our own minds. But sometimes you are the difficult person to love. And who knows? There's probably people out there who can't stand the fact that I preach at churches where I do not theologically agree with everything going on there. Like, there's probably people who, there could very easily be people who would be upset by that, who could be upset by that. I don't let that keep me up at night at all. I do what I do. And I'm just like people who I would disagree with. I think I'm faithfully serving the Lord this way, right? But the reality is that sometimes I'm going to be the one who's difficult to love. And sometimes people are going to look at the ministry I'm doing and saying, I can't believe he's doing that. I can't support that ministry at all. So I think that reality check, that theological reality check, might be a part of this as well, is that, if you're finding it difficult to love somebody right now, again, it's the political season. While it's the political season, keep in mind, sometimes you are the more difficult person to love. And, I think the mark of sanctification, of Christian maturity, of the whole lot is obviously not forever being the most difficult person to love, but I think that is a part of the scenario as well. And honestly, I think that's really all I have to say about this. I'm sorry that this is turning into, that the stereotype of a lot of Josh's podcasts is that he has all the questions and no solutions, especially on Dummy for Theology. So sorry that this is a little bit of a Dummy for Theology episode where I'm just kind of like waxing philosophically about what does this look like. But this is important. Like, this is still important to think about, especially if you've been in a situation like I have this year where I've been very burnt out and don't want to be around other Christians. I know I'm not the only one, but there is still this call, and we have so many like ways that we can look at this. But remember, when it comes to loving good works, stirring up one another to loving good works, I will come back to what I said in that sermon of do think about when you are with other believers, whatever that context looks like, what is the outcome? If it's not loving good works, then there is something that needs to be addressed with the people you consistently surround yourself with. But that's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening. If you haven't yet already, please make sure that you have rated and reviewed the show wherever you get your podcasts. Please share this episode with a friend who maybe could actually answer this question for all of us. We would really appreciate a better answer than what I have here today. And I already plugged ways to contact the show. I will say that My Seminary Life is obviously a part of the Anazao Ministries podcast network with other great theology podcasts like the Whole Church podcast, the Homily, and the Bible After Hours. You can also check out my sister show, Kung Fu Pizza Party, where I do weekly reviews of Kung Fu, ninja, or samurai flicks and occasional other fun martial art pop culture style episodes. And that is it. So heading into November here on the show, kind of taking this like in stride, trying to get things put back together here. Technically, this episode's coming out November 1st. Hi, everybody. Welcome to November. But kind of looking throughout the rest of the month of November, I have two more 2-part sermon series to get through November. Most of those, if I'm able to stay consistent, are going to be rabbit trails. There's a few other plans in the works. And yes, I'm doing 3 2-week sermon series, but December has a completely different plan to it. It's a whole month-long series, and again, we're going to take it all in stride. If you'd like, I can say Lord willing. We're going to actually use that sermon series to pivot to more of a traditional MSL education-focused series, but we're going to take it slow. We're getting back together here, so let's just kind of take it slow. I've been hearing some good reports back, though, on these rabbit trails, so I'm glad these are encouraging people and scratching an itch, that very specific itch you have for some My Seminary Life content in your life. And hey, if you're having that itch satisfied so well, and you want to say thank you, remember, if you want to do that financially, hey, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/MSLpod. You can make a one-time donation. You can support. I got a little fundraiser going on there to buy a new laptop. There's monthly ways, reoccurring monthly ways that you can support the show that will get you incentives like shout-outs and blog posts, other cool stuff like that. So yeah. Or there's a shop as well. All the links are in the description. Thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Brandon signing off. Remind you, as always, that theology is for everyone, so keep on studying. It's even for those who are difficult to love.